Welcome. This video interview is one of a series of 7. My name is Chris Heald. Throughout these videos, I will be interviewing John Beckford. During the COVID-19 pandemic in late 2020, John and I wondered why cybernetics and its learning about systems has not played a greater role in the global response to the pandemic. We concluded that cybernetics was not as accessible as it should be. So we decided to conduct these interviews. John is currently president of the Cybernetics Society and has written extensively on the subject. We are both consultant practitioners who use the ideas in our work. We have known one another and collaborated for approximately 20 years. We have never made videos before. Each one lasts about an hour. The series is in a logical order, but they are also designed to be standalone, so you don't need to watch them in sequence if you choose not to. We have had great fun making these videos, and as Stafford Beer might suggest, we hope you will find them more or less useful. Please feel free to contact either of us. Last time we concluded by just starting to explore 2 things, the Trialogue and the Potentiometer, and we promised that we would come back to them today and explore them in much more depth. And that indeed is what we are going to do in this episode. But before I hand over to John, I just thought it was worth mentioning that these are probably the 2 ideas from working with John and cybernetics that I'm most familiar with. So undoubtedly I will be making more stupid comments and seeing some errors in my ways during this conversation this afternoon. Anyway, John, should we start with the Trialogue? Is that the way place to start?
What do you want to know, Chris? Tell me what you want to know.
Well, you gave us a very brief overview at the end of the last session, but I think you should probably start with the kind of just giving an overview of how it looks and how it operates.
Okay, so start in the right place. The Trialogue was a product of the work that Peter Dudley did for his PhD in about 2000, where he was looking at the viable system models, the Stafford Beer's work, and considering what's called the meta system. That's the management functions of any organization within the notion of a viable system. And the way Stafford had created the model, it suggested that managing the present, the day-to-day management of the operational activity, and the need to create the future were in a conversation together. And that conversation was arbitrated by something that we call identity, by the notion of the value set, if you like, of the organization. When Peter was looking at that and critiquing it, he said, but the problem with the model is at that level that it's closed to its environment. It can't see all the things that are going on. And rather than just listening to the conversation between the future and the present, identity needs to actually intervene and be part of that conversation between the 3, because it's the values that are arising from identity that inform the decisions not that are made, but also that can be made within that value set. So Peter recreated the meta system within the viable system model to form the thing that we call the Trialogue. That's made up of 4 elements. It's just called Trialogue, but it's 4 elements. Trialogue because it's a conversation. In the same way as dialogue, Trialogue, it's a conversation in 3 parts, but that conversation itself is the 4th element. So what we've got is 3 things going on. We've got a part of the organization that is monitoring and managing the current activities of the organization, seeing what's going on, making sure it works within budget and it delivers what it's going to do, and all that sort of good operational control stuff. That's element 1. Element 2 is creating the future. That's the dialogue between the organization and its environment, in which the organization is talking to the environment and saying, we're doing these things, call it marketing if you like, but it's also listening to the environment and responding to the things that are happening outside itself. So that then sets up a tension. So on the one hand, the operational control is saying, do more of the same. That's essentially what it tries to do. It tries to do faster, cleaner, cheaper, more efficient. Creating the future is saying, oh, but there is this opportunity, there is this need, there is this requirement that we're not currently addressing. So saying we as the organisation ought to get involved in meeting this new need. And a good working example at the moment would be we all drive around or largely drive around in cars with internal combustion engines. And in 10 years' time, we're going to be driving around in cars that one way or another are propelled by the use of electricity. So there's a shift happening in the environment around us, and running a more efficient petrol engine will only get us so far, because at some point we're going to have to shift to electrical. We've seen this week announcements by Jaguar and Ford, both saying their fleets will be entirely electric within the next few years. That creates a tension, because what they earn money doing today is making petrol engine cars. What they're going to make money doing in 10 years' time is making battery engine cars. And they've got to somehow or other manage a transition between the two. So there's tension between what we want to be tomorrow and what we are currently being today. Now you can leave that tension unresolved, and managing the present will have what's called the high gain amplifier in electrical terms. It will have effectively control of the bulk of the resources of the organisation, so it can carry on being more and more efficient at doing what it does today. That inhibits its ability to do something different tomorrow. So the third element of the trialogue is what we call the identity, the value set of the people in the organisation who are listening to the argument between these two elements and applying the values in order to arbitrate a different way forward, a way of resolving the tension between where we are today and where we need to be tomorrow. So the conversation in three parts is the fourth element, the bit that sits in the middle. So on the identity, we're also seeking to sustain identity. That means that there has to be an engagement, and I mean there has to be an engagement between the people who constitute the organisation, the people from whom the organisation actually emerges, and the sense of that organisation's identity. So there has to be a sharing of values, beliefs between, if you like, the people who do the work of the organisation and the value set that the organisation espouses, so that we actually get a coherence between the value set of the people and the decisions that are being made. And where you don't get that coherence of value set, you quite clearly can see the tensions in the organisation, and whether it's industrial action by people, or choosing to go and work somewhere else, or buy different products, whatever, that's when that tension exposes itself. In electoral terms, we see it if there's not a shared identity between government and government in a country. We see tensions emerge either in the shape of a different government elected at election time, or sometimes you see a revolution happening. So so does that capture it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good starter. So, I mean, we need to unpack and unpick some of that, and actually, I'd like to start with that identity stuff, because, you know, I've often wondered how conscious you need to be about that, and how deliberate that is, because you know, I get the idea that you're making choices about allocation of focus between now and managing the present, creating the future, but you know, how aware do we have to be about that identity when we're articulating that and having that conversation?
Depends to some extent how strong the sense of identity in the organisation itself is. If there is coherence of values and beliefs, then the right thing to do within that value set is quite apparent. So everybody knows that this is what we're doing, and therefore they do the right thing anyway. And so some of the arguments around the effectiveness of teams, for example, one of the good things, you know, effective teams tend to have shared values, tend to have shared beliefs about the things that are to be achieved. And if they have different beliefs about the things that are to be achieved, different parts of the team pull in different directions, and the effectiveness declines. What always I look for is consistency between the things that we say as leaders of organizations and the decisions that we make as leaders of organizations. So when I'm looking at an organization from the outside, when I'm working with one, what I'm looking for is coherence between what people say and what people do. Experience suggests that the bigger the gap between the saying and the doing, the more energy needs to be put into the maintenance of identity, because actually the leadership are not behaving in a manner which is authentic with the values that they're espousing. And for me, that's a real problem, because what we then see is that the other people within the organization respond more to what the leaders do than to what the leaders say. So they observe the behavior of their leaders and they tend to mimic or emulate that behavior, because that's a good way of being seen to belong. So what's really important is that consistency between what is said and what is done.
Yeah, no, I get that. That's because actually my experience says that those organizations that are consistent and have strong cultures and identities often are the ones that struggle to articulate it, which is partly where my question about their ability, how important it is to be conscious of that. So what you're highlighting, I think, is that an observer, if they see congruence and alignment and consistency, then you can kind of be reassured by that. It's when you see dissonance that you need to be worried about what impact that identity part is having on the conversation.
Oh, absolutely, and I think the congruence is key. The cybernetics of that dialogue are really then quite interesting, because we move away from the, if you like, the hard cybernetics of control systems and process devices and reports, to the psycho-cybernetics of an engagement between two or more individuals talking about something. So all the work that you and I have both done over many years about effective listening, effective communication, all of that knowledge is the thing that comes to bear in that space, that says if the leader is espousing one thing and doing something else, what's the ability of the individual working within the organization to then challenge that, or to ask questions about it, to interrogate it, if you like, and say, so what's really going on here? What's really important to you, leader? You're saying this, you're doing that. What really matters? And of course, people with a strong sense of their own identity to act authentically will then walk away from that situation. Well, I'll go and work somewhere else where the values that are espoused and the values that are acted on are more clearly the same. I think in fact, there's a potentially an evangelical dimension to it, where, and religions are probably a good example, religions espouse a particular belief system, a creed, if you like, and belongingness means alignment to the creed. We may not want to hear and feel the same thing about the sort of more mundane organizations that operate banks or run car factories, but there's a significant element of that seeking to align the values of the people that work in the organization with a particular view of the world in order to make it more coherent for them. If you don't do that, then the dissonance will probably grow.
The religion one's quite interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, you can feel connected to a religion and its identity without believing in quite a few of the things it does day to day. So, for instance, I'm sure there are plenty of members of the Church of England who, you know, do not approve of the way in which, they would deal with gay issues and the rights of women over the years. But they feel more strongly connected to the identity than they do to the kind of current leadership. So that's quite an interesting thing, that you get held by that identity in that organisation or faith.
So, well, I think some of that belongs to the question of to whom is the individual giving their loyalty, from whom are they seeking that authenticity? So a member of a parish in a church might well think that the vicar is a complete twit. May well think that the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Pope has got it entirely wrong about some aspects, such as, you know, homosexual relations or whatever. But they're actually believing in their God and a credo rather than in the physical artifact of the church and its inadequate human beings on the planet. So there's, you know, so the loyalty is to a much bigger idea than the physical instantiation of a particular church or church system in a country. And that's really interesting, because that really is saying, here is a set of values to which I will adhere, and I will deal with the inadequacies of the human artifacts that arise from that, because actually my belief in the higher order system is much greater than those inadequacies, you know, for me.
Yeah, so I'm moving away from religion, but in organisational terms, I probably inaccurately have seen people talk about, you know, that point of conversation. They often put leadership there. But what I'm hearing you describing here is that that's not actually a role of leadership. It's much more about that kind of alignment and consistency of across the whole of the entity.
That's an interesting one. So for me, leadership is emergent in that sense.
You might need to expand on there.
If we put 10 people in a shared space with a common question, one or more of those people will emerge as the leader of that group. And that leadership will sit with an alignment of beliefs around how the problem might be solved or how the situation might be addressed or whatever. And a lot of that then is not just about who's got some ideas, but actually the ability to articulate those ideas, to persuade and to cajole and encourage. What we call leadership is often managership in organizations rather than leadership. So we as owners of a system might appoint somebody to be a chief executive, to be a manager of some sort. What we're not very good at doing is helping them to understand what that really means, and what is it we want from somebody who we've called them manager or managing director, but actually we're asking them to perform a more complex task than just managership. And part of that is about creating the context in which individuals can perform, and we might call that creation of a context leadership. Part of it is about managership. It's about being accountable for certain decisions being made, and frankly some of it is administrative management in the sense of regulation has to be applied, rules have to be followed, situations, contexts have to be created in which work can be done safely and profitably, and so on. So actually we're looking at something which has three elements within that identity, because actually all three of those things form part of the notion of identity within the organization, which is where the authenticity and the consistency come from. So if I'm saying I love all people, and on the other hand I'm then declining to offer jobs to women or homosexuals or non-white people, I'm not behaving in a manner which is consistent with the things that I'm espousing. So my decisions and my sayings are not coherent. So that congruence around the ways in which we say and do things that are consistent with us is critical. And Tom Peters in the 1980s, in Search of Excellence, wrote about walking the talk.
Yeah.
Do what you say what you do, and get that consistency in there. And the attempt to extract one of those three elements and emphasize it is problematic, because actually they are coherent, synthesized things. If I'm behaving one way and saying something else, then it's no good talking to me about leadership. You've also got to talk to me about decisionship in that space.
But what you're adding, I think, is walking the talk in a way that is consistent with the identity and the culture that other people involved in it believe in. And I guess you're getting to a place which says, well, certain systems will reject leaders that are appointed to them because they simply do not fit with the kind of the identity and the norms of that organisation, and they get rejected by it. And they
Indeed, and that's actually, yeah, remarkably uncommon, but it should be a lot more common in many respects. So there's something, the shared value set between the leadership and the led, if you like, between the governors and the governed, is absolutely critical. And in political terms, we have an electoral process where we seek to pursue that alignment. So we should be voting for people to be in our local council or parliament who reflect our values and beliefs. So some of their policies may not be quite right, but essentially we tend to align with people who are like us in a very large degree. Where that doesn't happen in electoral terms, we boot them out at the next election. In the governance of organisations, you have an additional complexity, which is that you have ownership as well. So you have, in the governance of a major corporation, you will have, for example, a chief executive, a chief operating officer, a finance director, etc. Working together, they construct, if you like, the trialogue between them. But they've been tasked with delivering a form of organisation by its owners. So what you're then looking at is, what is the owner's objective? What do the owners want from their ownership? And they can be quite distant. If it's a major public corporation, the owners might be people like you and I as shareholders in pension schemes. Or they might be like Asda, largely owned or was largely owned by one family. So you've actually got to then look at not just what is the organisation doing, so what's the trialogue for the organisation and how does it manage its identity, but also how is its identity managed by its owning group, by the people who then exercise influence on it. So the organisation is contained inside a higher order organisation, which conditions what it wants from it. And now whether that's national government to local government to ultra local government, or a branch of a retail store through to a global corporation, those constraining conversations are happening. So our trialogue is embedded inside a higher order trialogue, where the stakeholders in that higher order trialogue may have a different perspective. And
that kind of nesting idea, which fits with the sort of the way I've seen the trialogue drawn out, with the kind of recursive pieces that you get down to smaller elements of the system. I mean, I guess that we move on from identity in a moment, but actually if identity is lived consistently and understood across an organisation, then those nested smaller parts of the system will make their choices between future and present in a kind of aligned way. That's the point you're making there about why that identity is so critical in that conversation about those choices.
So the identity bit is critical. The thing that then goes with it is the competence of the organisation and the people within it to manage autonomy.
Okay.
So
well, and a willingness to organise in that sort of diversified and centralised.
To the willingness to distribute power.
Yeah.
So that the lowest level, the lowest order organisation within the entire construct has as much freedom as is consistent with continuing to belong to the whole. So if I'm a Catholic priest, then and I'm running a parish, then I have immense freedom within the construct of the church to run my parish as I see fit within Catholic doctrine. What I can't do is decide to run my Catholic church as an Anglican church. So I don't have that freedom. I won't have individually the freedom to get married, because that takes me outside the set of rules. But within, operating within that set of rules, then I have great freedom. The choice I have to make as an individual is, do my beliefs, does my identity fit sufficiently consistently with the higher order organisation to which I'm choosing to belong for me to want to be a member and to be content as a member? Because being part of a higher organisation will always impose some constraint on the freedom of the individual. And that's a challenging area.
Yeah, and if you reverse that, and I'm the biggest cheese in the whole organisation, then where I have to be aware and careful is that I should minimise my involvement in your decisions and interference, and maximise the freedom I give to you. While as long as we're confident that there's an alignment around the way in which you'll make those choices, i.e. the identity part.
Absolutely, and the challenge on a practical level is that often people end up in positions of identityship, we'll call it for the purposes of this conversation. They end up in that position where they're trying to synthesize this management of values, management of decisions, management of belongingness, and actually sometimes, quite often, they lack the confidence. Sometimes they lack the competence to be in that position, because what it requires in order to be effective is the ability to trust, is the ability to let go and to allow that other people in the organization may achieve the same things by different means. They may work in slightly different ways. They may work in ways and make decisions that I wouldn't. But I have to trust that they're still aligning with achieving the same outcomes, and allow them, grant them that freedom to do it a different way, provided they work within the minimal set of constraints that we've agreed is necessary. So the essence of sustainability, if you like, in an organization in that sense, is that if we can't have that complex, difficult conversation, if we can't have that honesty and transparency, if we can't have that ability to let go, then we will always constrain the organization. What we have to do then is create, if you like, an information architecture, whether that's informal in the sort of style of a conversation, or formal in the sense of a reporting structure and a reporting system, that, if you like, forces those layers appropriately apart, so that we actually locate decisions structurally within the organization in alignment with the information, in alignment with the autonomy, so that I can say to somebody, this is your bit, you are in charge, these are the outcomes I want, this is the minimal set of constraints within which you must operate, and we sign in blood for that, and then I stand back and let them get on with it. We
reach a kind of psychological contract about how we're going to go about doing that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what we often find is that senior management, lacking that trust, maybe lacking that confidence and competence, intervenes in the decisions of the lower order systems, partly because it hasn't had that explicit conversation, so the rules haven't been created, partly because actually those decisions are easier to make than the really, really big ones that we wanted a chief executive to make. So there tends to be a retreat towards the lower order decisions because they're easier to deal with.
So if we're looking at the rules, then I'm going to make a bit of a leap here, because I'm going to go back to the kind of mix between managing the present and creating the future. Do you have any kind of rule of thumb in your head about how much of my energy, time, and mind share should be going on each of those things? I mean, because what we're looking at is needing to get the decisions right about the balance between them, but we have to pay attention to them both before we can even get that dialogue going on, don't we?
Very much so, and that's quite a complicated
That's complicated.
It won't surprise you to hear. The most successful chief executives in many respects that I've come across over the years have been the ones that spend the greatest part of their time thinking. So the question really becomes, what is it we want? What is it we want these people in the organisation to actually be doing? So if we have delegated successfully to competent people with a clear set of rules about how things would work and an adequate set of performance reports, so that we have a good information flow about what's going on, we as senior managers don't have to spend a lot of time on it, because what we're doing is looking over the fence and saying, everything all right, Charlie? Is it going well? Are you are you on budget? Are you on time? Are you achieving the outcomes? Are your customers happy? Are your staff happy? We can ask a sort of key set of questions, and as long as the answers come back as true, if you like, and as long as when we audit such processes, because we have the right to audit, we find that what we're being told and what we see through the audit are consistent with each other, then we can kind of leave them to get on with it. So we have a reassurance through the information flow that says, I asked you to do these things, you're clearly doing these things within the set of rules that we've agreed, fine, carry on. So
and that set of that dashboard needs to be simple and focused, doesn't it? So
absolutely,
we're not getting into the detail. We're looking at the right level of stuff. So a handful of key indicators rather than loads and loads of detail.
Yes, and we have to then, to do that, we have to understand what is important.
Yeah,
we have to have agreed what's important. I remember doing some work with a railway company nearly 20 years ago, and they said we're coming up with some new KPIs, and I thought that was great, and let's have a look at them. And there were 636 KPIs. I know it's quite clearly nonsensical. I got it down in my head to 5, which is, are your customers happy? Are your staff happy? Are you keeping people safe? Are you running your trains on time? And are you earning more money than you're spending? I mean, that was it. Because at the senior level, that was all that really mattered, because they'd appointed a chief operating officer to do all that. So let him get on with it and give him the freedom to come and ask for help when he needs it. So if we've got that running, then how much resource do we need to put into being able to do that well will be a function of the size and shape and nature of the organisation. So in 2021, the key to those things is good management of data and good construction of reporting systems, so that we can minimise our interference, maximise the autonomy, and be really, really clear about understanding what's going on. As a proportion of total organisational resource, it will probably still be 90 or 95% of it that's doing that. So 90 to 95% of it, I may well still be focused on doing the day job. The other 5% or 30% might be whoever is sitting, and it's quite often a group of people, looking at what's happening in the environment, why is it happening, how is it happening, what are the implications for us, what should we be doing about it, what messages should we put out into the environment, what things should we be bringing back in. So this is the sort of creating the future activity. So if you are a major burger chain distributing burgers in hundreds of countries all over the world, the proportion of your total organisation that's looking at what do we do tomorrow is probably quite small. The length of time for a change of direction is quite long, because there's big investment in capital equipment and shops and so on. But the shift itself can be quite profound. In the, what do they call it, the C-suite these days, in the sort of chief executive, chief operating officer's office, what they should be doing, my view, is be permanently embedded in this conversation between the three parts. So actually, when I'm making a decision as a chief operating officer, as a chief executive, I'm never making a decision about today or tomorrow or values. I'm making a decision about all three every time. So every decision that I'm making is informed by those three dimensions of the trialogue. So I'm saying, is this working today? Will it work tomorrow? What's consistent with our value set? Before I left the bank, I worked for the chief executive, and when he appointed me to a particular project role, he said, there's only really one rule, John. I said, what's that? He said, if you're going to really upset somebody, will you tell me in advance? Because he put me into a role that required radical change, transformation within the bank. And what he wanted to know was that if he was going to get, going to the executive dining room, whether he was going to get sort of hijacked by somebody who I'd upset on the way through the process. So that's really interesting. So he wanted to be pre-warned. Now I knew, because I'd worked in the organisation for a long time, I knew what the organisation's values were. I knew what the belief system was. I knew what the constraints of today were, and I knew what the demands of tomorrow were. So I was able to have twice in 18 months that conversation with Tony that said, I'm planning to do this and I know it's going to upset everybody, so be prepared. Because actually the ethos of the organisation was so strong, the value set was so clearly articulated that you knew when you were going to disrupt something. So there's something there that you're looking at those complex decisions in the sort of trialogue space, and with the awareness, particularly of the value set, you can make a very accurate assertion about what the right thing to do is under any particular given set of circumstances, and you can be aware of the consequences of the decision that you're trying to make. So you almost don't need to talk about it then.
I mean, when you're talking about creating the future, that's where linked to the external environment and, you know, scanning the future and all of that stuff. And I think what you're saying is that, you know, it's not the preserve of, but that absolutely has to be in the minds of the C-suite and senior people the whole time in their kind of trialogue, the way in which they're running the organisation.
For me, it should almost be dominant.
Yeah.
Because, you know, particularly in a large organisation, you've got a whole welter of people and systems and machines telling you how well you did yesterday. So provided you've structured your information flow appropriately, then you kind of know all that stuff. And if you've delegated properly, if you've given people appropriate autonomy, you know they're going to tell you if it's going wrong. So you can you should be able to kind of not worry about it. So the attention can then be on what is our best response to what's likely to happen tomorrow, the future being inherently uncertain, the decisions you're making are inherently probabilistic. So what you're trying to do through the creating the future activity is understand what, I think it was Ross Acuff called, understand the future you're currently in. What's it going to be like if we don't change? And then adjust the posture of the organisation. So the energy is about adaptation rather than about control. The focus is, if we are going to consistently be us in the future, then we need to act and behave in these ways. We need to do these things. We need to stop doing those things. So that the whole focus of the trialogue conversation is about the adaptation of the organisation rather than the control of any particular thing. And one big chunk of it is about influencing the environment of the organisation to make it more amenable to the things that we want to do. So we're trying to attract it towards us, and we're trying to attract us towards it. So there's a co-adaptation going on. Critical thing to remember. So I might be, as I am, working on a 10-year strategy for an organisation for dealing with climate change, and nothing that I do for them today or don't do them for them today is going to make any material difference in the next few weeks. But in that organisation, which employs 100,000 people, give or take, there are people who are concerned with today's operational delivery of the service. And their time horizon, mine is 10 years, theirs might be the end of the shift, the end of the day's operations. So they're seeking to create the future for today. So their time horizon is the end of the shift, or the end of the day's production operations. And they're seeking to, within their trialogue, optimize what's happening within that very, very different time frame with a very much more constrained set of freedoms. The argument is the same. It's just being held at a different level with a different time frame and a different degree of freedom associated with it. So we have that trialogue happening at every defined level of the organization in terms of this set of nested recursions, and managing that autonomy probably ought to take up more of people's time than it does.
Yeah, and that point about influencing the environment, I mean, I have the car example in my head that you referenced earlier, because if we believe we're brilliant at electric cars, then we presumably want to influence the environment to bring forward the requirement for electric cars nearer to today than otherwise, because actually we want to accelerate that process. So
because
I'm conscious that we've been in this trialogue for quite a long while, and I promised Potentiometer as well as trialogue. Are you happy to move on, or are there bits of the trialogue we really need to delve further into?
Well, we can always come back to the trialogue, and in some senses, talking about the potentiometer is talking about the trialogue, but in slightly different language, if that helps.
Yes, I understand there's a connection, so let's make it, shall we?
Okay. So the potentiometer is a device in electrical engineering for managing the electrical flow through equipment. So we'll all be familiar with a rheostat for turning up and down the dashboard lights on our car. So we turn it to the right, we put more power through, we get a bright light. We turn it back down, and we get less light. So that's a sort of the mechanical artifact that goes with the idea, is saying by controlling the flow of energy, we can control the level of illumination. So the potentiometer is about trying to be able to do three things. One is creating a construct which enables us to compare things which might otherwise be very, very different. So we can compare apples with pears through a potentiometer. What we're trying to understand is not what's the absolute performance, particularly. We're trying to understand with a potentiometer how much of the available resource is being applied to the outcome that we wanted to achieve. Now, whether that's the HR function dealing with recruitment or the production function dealing with making widgets, what we're interested in is how well has this part of the organization applied its resource in pursuit of its objective. So we have to say, HR is 80% efficient and operations is 80% efficient. So their performance is comparable, even though one might be huge and the other might be tiny. To construct a potentiometer, it consists of three elements. Element one, and the core of the whole thing, is a formal statement of the capability of a particular process or an element of an organization to achieve an outcome. So what we're saying is this process has this capability. And it might be a number of trains per day, or a number of widgets per hour, or a number of Big Macs produced, or anything of that type. We're then comparing what we said we could do, the capability, with what actually happened. So if we said we could produce 100 and we produced 80, then what we've said is we're 80% efficient. We've done 80% of the work that we said we could do. So conventional economics, accounting, whatever, efficiency, productivity, it's the same stuff. What it's saying is this is the measure of the utilization of the current resources available. If we want to improve, this is where we link back to the trialogue, if we want to manage the present better, the task of managing the present is to reduce the gap between capability and actuality. So we improve actual performance to increase efficiency to get as close to 100% as it's possible to get. So we can see that in terms of managing the present, because capability is defining what we're currently capable of doing. When we want to look at potential, the third level of the potentiometer, what we're saying is there are certain constraints that apply. The factory is so big, we've only got that number of staff, we've only got this much light or this much energy, this much raw material. So there are constraints that stop the organization, stop the system producing more of whatever it happens to be. That might be the shift from internal combustion engines to electric cars. It might be all sorts of, if we had more gherkins, we could make more burgers. It doesn't really matter. There's some constraint on the process that stops it doing more. So a second level of the potentiometer is comparing what we're currently doing, capability, with potential, what we could do if the constraints were overcome. So understanding that gap, and the gap we call latency, lets us understand what the needs are of the organization in terms of creating its future. Because we can look at that and say, we're here, we want to be there, the things that are inhibiting us are this, so we can look into the environment and find a way of overcoming that constraint. It might be we need more money, it might be we need access to a different marketplace, it might be different sources of energy, all sorts of might be's. So we can then bring that in. So what we've now got is the two elements, if you like, of the trialogue. starting to now say, you know, we're 80% efficient, but we're only 80%, you know, our capability is only 80% of our potential. Because when we multiply those two things together, what we realize is that effectiveness, which is the total product of the whole thing, the end point, so latency and productivity, 0.8 times 0.8 is 0.64. So actually what we're then saying is, the measure of effectiveness of the organization is it's only realizing 64% of its potential. And we can close that gap, we can increase that 64% to 100% by improving efficiency in the short term, doing things better, by better operational control, by managing things, managing the present better, and by strategic decisions about a different future, about overcoming those constraints. So effectiveness is offset, if you like, against the notion of identity, because identity is where we get from the notion of who we are. So when we say, actually, you know, we're this sort of organization, we believe in these things, and the outcomes we're trying to achieve are those, effectiveness is the measure of the extent to which we've actually met those ambitions and outcomes. So there's your potentiometer linking perfectly into the logic of the trialogue in a way which lets us have a really interesting conversation with anybody in the organization, depending on their level and their role, about how effective their contribution is to the whole.
And my experience, and actually probably assumption, says that although you've used 80% and 80% there, the percentage of latency is likely to be much higher, lower. I mean, there's much more to get there. So I guess it often troubles me that organisations will focus on the incremental improvement they can make by managing their present, rather than look to their future and realise what the potential is there and what they have got that they could take advantage of. Maybe I'm wrong with that assumption.
No, I think there's a whole bunch of elements to that. So number one is fear of the unknown. So one of the problems with creating the future is you generate a different level of uncertainty. And the other, and this is quite a big psychological one probably, for managers in organizations, and it sounds terribly critical, it probably is. If I look down at your bit of the organization and say, Christopher, you could do better, you're only getting 80 and you should be getting 100, I'm making it your problem to fix. If I look out into the future and say, oh, John, you're only getting 80 and you could get 100, but there's some risk associated with it, then I'm making it my problem. So, and this is where we come back to this idea of managership as opposed to anything else, is if I can blame you, that's probably psychologically more convenient for me than taking responsibility myself. And actually, if you watch organizations, it is quite, it takes a while, but you watch an organization for a while and you see that they, they're trundling along, and sales of product X start to fall a little bit. So they put some more sales incentives in, and then that doesn't work. So a little bit later on, they might change a sales manager or two, or they change a sales director. When that still doesn't work, they say, well, we better look at, well, it's a marketing problem. So we don't replace the sales director, we change the marketing director. So we sort of elevate the problem. What we rarely see until it's all gone really horribly wrong is anybody kind of going, I tell you what, that chief executive's not very good. We don't see a chief executive saying, well, actually the biggest problem around here is me. We don't observe, to anywhere near the extent that I think we could and should, an authentic discussion, and authenticity is really important, where the chief executive or even the board create a context in which a meaningful conversation can be had about how to improve things. And that's really problematic, because an awful lot of power comes into, power, particularly a positional power within the organization, comes into play. And if I'm going to be accountable to the board, it's much easier for me to walk in and say, oh, sales have been appalling, I've sacked him, and I get praised for decisive action, even though I haven't actually solved the problem. But I've been seen to take action on it because action this day is more important, perhaps, or seem to be more important than saying, actually, chaps, we've got the wrong product, we're selling it in the wrong market, it costs too much, and all the other challenges that might exist, or it's no longer appropriate to sell V8 petrol engine cars in an environment where the world is demanding battery electric vehicles.
I mean, and I guess there's a blindness, isn't there, at that senior level? I mean, you talk about the coming of electric cars, we're probably all reasonably aware of that going on. I recall when Direct Line was starting to sell insurance, and the established insurers like Eagle Star and others went kind of, well, that'll never catch on. That'll be, a few percentage points at the margins of this marketplace, and a complete blindness to what might happen in terms of the.
So some of these things, and it's what Taleb calls the black swans, things that we should be able to do better, but quite often we can only see them in retrospect.
Okay.
Because from where we are standing, we can't understand the implications of some of those decisions. And that particular one, because I was in the bank at the time that Direct Line came into being, and there were two things that Direct Line did, but only one of them was particularly visible. So the thing that was visible was being able to do stuff down a telephone wire, to be able to ring somebody up and do all that. The real win for Direct Line was they carved out the low risk section of the market and only offered policies to the people in the middle. So if you were at the extremes either of youth or age or power of your vehicle, they effectively didn't make you a product offer. So they did two things in parallel that transformed that market, not just one. And most people missed the second one about the market segmentation, which of course now been replicated everywhere. But at the time, they took the concept of the common pool and created a recursive structure within the common pool that said, we'll take a common pool out of the common pool of all the low risk activity, which is quite clever.
Yeah.
But we didn't see people didn't see it happening at the time. And yes, you're right, all the major insurers turned around and thought it won't affect us. And they were aware of it, but chose to ignore it. The same is happening with banking even now, where the increasingly over the last few years, high street branches have closed, and online banking has grown, despite the size of those estates. And there's still sort of kind of a bit of a rearguard action going on around some of those bits.
Yeah, so potentiometer though, I mean, I think you've made a really neat link to the managing the present and the creating the future part. I mean, presumably, it's the sort of thing that ought to be appearing on that dashboard of indicators about where our latency is and where our failure to fully utilize our current resources is happening.
Yeah, and if you, the ones that I've built for clients over the years have been about understanding the segmentation, so understanding what's sitting in potential, what's sitting in current capability, what's sitting in actual operational performance, and using the information to point at the room for improvement and its location. So I built one for a sterile supply firm years ago that pointed out where the problem was, as in which day of the week, what time of the day, which part of the process. So you could actually go from the dashboard to the precise point in the week where the failure was happening. And in the simulation version, you could look at where the future problems were likely to occur. And it's complex because that particular one, to give you an idea of the scale, had about 2 million calculations in it. And so trying to follow that by hand is impossible. So actually you have to create a structure which you can interrogate so you can understand that. But it was able to say, on a Thursday afternoon, given this volume at 3 o'clock, that bit of the process will get into trouble. So if you know that's going to happen and today's Tuesday, you've got 2 days to sort it out. So you can actually, going back to the black swans idea, you can make the black swan go away, because you can anticipate the problem. So he's now starting to go from a reporting system that says, this is where you were. These are the things you achieved against the things that you said you were going to achieve. And you can apply improvement effort to that at the sort of, if you like, the next cycle of the process. But you can also use that data to make meaningful assertions about what's likely to happen at the next cycle, what's likely to happen next time, at various scales of granularity, where you might be looking at the end of this shift, but you might be looking at 20 or 30 production lines and aggregating that up and saying, we have a problem with this at this higher level. By making those assertions about the future, you can pre-solve them. You can kind of go, we know we're going to have a problem on Thursday, so we'll do this now in order to ameliorate the problem, and that allows us to improve the performance. If we feed into that information about the marketplace, we can start to synthesize our future with our present. So by understanding how well we're doing, by understanding what's likely to happen, and is only ever a likely to, we can create a structure in which we can navigate our way into a smoother future using the information we've created about what's happening in the market, what's happening inside the organization, through what's actually a relatively simple device in the sense of the potentiometer, but joined together in a form which aggregates both horizontally along the process flow and vertically up through the organization.
And we should wrap up quite soon, but I'm about to loop that idea right back to the identity, because, you know, presumably over time, the identity incorporates a continuous improvement, you know, creation of an adaptive system in your language. That becomes part of the identity and the way in which you operate and the culture. So these things are embedded in the system to help it adapt.
Almost they are the system. So rather than being embedded in the system, they kind of are the system. So what we're doing is saying, you know, at every opportunity, we're reflecting on what happened and trying to make it better. We're anticipating what could happen and trying to amplify the good stuff and damp the bad stuff. So we're continually steering the organization. And you know, that has implications for the cycle time of reporting, has implications for decisions, and particularly in a large organization, it gives us the real reason, from a purely practical point of view, setting aside anything else, why we have to delegate decision power. Because there are far too many decisions having to be taken far too quickly for any chief executive to sit in his or her office and pretend to make them all.
Make them all, yes.
Yeah, it's a sort of an act of madness to centralize stuff that, you know, all you can guarantee is that in a centralized system, the personal people at the center are making bad decisions incompetently. That's the only sort of certainty you can have about that, because they can't possibly know all the things they need to know to make the decisions they're trying to make.
And on that note, do you think we can call that a day for today?
I think that feels like a wrap for today, doesn't it?
So,
Definitely.
yes, thank you very much. So we've Trialogue and Potentiometer and how they connect with one another. And look forward to seeing you all soon.